We do need to be aware of the very, very real risk of a military coup. We don't need to rebuild Bangladesh on the failed model of British liberal bourgeois democracy.
Bangladeshi authorities estimate that a staggering $234 billion was siphoned out of the country during Hasina's rule. A lot of that money obviously came right here to London.
And I think it's very, very likely that British democracy, liberal democracy itself, will fail soon.
BBC Investigations has verified leaked audio from last year, in which Sheikh Hasina herself can be heard instructing security forces to use lethal weapons against protesters.
The dictators and the authoritarians who think they control the state can't actually control it, and actually it's us who can control it.
Hello and welcome to Decolonial Dispatch, your fortnightly update on global affairs, where we highlight the stories of struggle and liberation that are often ignored from an anti-colonial perspective. It's been a year since the Monsoon Revolution overthrew one of the most corrupt governments in the world in Bangladesh. But here's the thing, it's only a decolonial struggle if the popular classes win. The ultimate winner will not emerge from parliament buildings or international conferences, but from the daily struggles of ordinary Bangladeshis building power from below. The technocrats do their thing, old parties try to play their games, but the Monsoon Revolution will only win if the institutions of the grassroots build power, regardless of who takes government. Power will only be transitory, by the way, if we're just talking about government, and that could lead even to the next coup. Will the revolution win, or are we entering into a phase of counter-revolution? This and more on this episode of Decolonial Dispatch. This past Tuesday, August 5th, the country's interim leader, Mohammed, announced that national elections will be held in February. This will be the first election since students and workers overthrew Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, or former Prime Minister. Celebrations have filled the streets of Dhaka, with many calling the movement the country's second liberation. As a Sudanese person who's seen a revolution up close, I have to say that all of this seems familiar. We remember that joy, and we hope that Bangladesh will be the one to bring us in to a new era. But while the atmosphere is hopeful, deep political cracks are already showing. The interim leader, Yunus, is an 85-year-old Nobel laureate, a great liberal man if you ask the Western press. But he doesn't share the decolonial approach the revolutionaries are calling for. His public statements have focused on a simple technocratic goal: transfer power to an elected government, ensure the elections are peaceful, and keep the state running. In other words, liberalism. In our context, liberalism means upholding the class structure of society while engaging in institutional reform. It's a politics of compromise always, and often loses to authoritarianism. Meanwhile, Sheikh Hasina remains safe in neighbouring India, defying court orders to face trial for crimes against humanity. The UN estimates over 1,400 people were killed on her watch. The anniversary event centred on a July declaration, a document meant to honour the student-led uprising. Yet, as we'll see, the very students who led the charge are deeply dissatisfied, all under the shadow of counter-revolution from Hasina's now banned Awami League party. Now let's bring things closer to home. Here's an interesting one, involving Keir Starmer's Labour Party. As you know, London isn't just a meeting ground for revolutionaries in exile. It's also where the families of our post-colonial elites are often raised, because of all the good schools and flats and everything. Now, this is obviously no problem, provided that these people support the people's struggle for democracy. But often that just doesn't happen. Case in point, Labour MP Tulip Siddique, who once proudly called the ousted dictator of Bangladesh, her own aunt, Sheikh Hasina, a role model for her daughter. The spotlight in Britain is now on Siddique, the MP for Hampstead and Highgate. And imagine how rich you would need to be the MP of Hampstead and Highgate, because she's been ordered to face trial in Bangladesh over corruption allegations. The country's anti-corruption commission accuses her of illegally receiving land as part of her aunt's regime. She denies it, of course, calling it a politically motivated smear campaign, and she's resigned her ministerial post, citing the allegations were a distraction. A distraction from what exactly? Who knows? But this isn't just about one MP. It's a window into a massive system of plunder. Bangladeshi authorities estimate that a staggering $234 billion was siphoned out of the country during Hasina's rule. A lot of that money obviously came right here to London. There's even a separate investigation into a $3.9 billion connected to a Russian-funded nuclear power plant deal in 2013, which Sadiq also denies. The Sudanese folks will get this. The Bengalis have the equivalent of what we call Kezan. Now, back in Bangladesh, the new government is making symbolic moves to hold the old regime accountable. Sheikh Hasina's former official residence, the lavish Gana Bahan Palace, is being converted into a museum, a memorial to her misrule and the 1,400 protesters killed during the uprising. And the case against Hasina has been strengthened by a bombshell piece of evidence. BBC Investigations has verified leaked audio from last year, in which Sheikh Hasina herself can be heard instructing security forces to use lethal weapons against protesters, confirming what survivors have been saying all along. With this evidence and a trial in absentia, the new Bangladesh is trying to ensure the past is never forgotten. But it will take a lot more than a museum to win the future. Okay, so we've set the scene. Now let's get deeper. What was the Monsoon Revolution really about? It began when students rebelled against a government job quota reserving 30% of posts for descendants of 1971 freedom fighters. But why is that a bad thing? Aren't freedom fighters the good guys? Well, in many post-colonial countries, yesterday's freedom fighters have become today's dictators. The ruling Awami Party used that legacy to create a patronage network. The total job quota was a massive 56%. Let's visualize this. 30% of jobs for the civil service was to go to descendants of freedom fighters. In a sense, you could call this a new kind of weird royalty system. And 10% were for women, but let's also be real. A lot of these women were going to be Awami League supporters too. And then you get 10% for specific districts. And then finally, after all of that, you get a 5% quota for ethnic minorities to join the civil service and 1% for people with disabilities. What that meant was you only had 44% of the jobs left that were open to people who were not in these categories. For most working class students, getting a government job was impossible. So in 2024, when the government brought back the system, Awami League essentially said, even though they acquiesced to the demands in 2018, psych, you're not getting these jobs. And that was the spark. The process exploded into a nationwide movement against corruption and inequality. The government's response was brutal. A shoot-on-sight curfew, an internet blackout, and 1,400 killed. Hasina justified it by labeling anyone not in her clique Rajakar, a traitor. On national TV, she asked, if the grandchildren of freedom fighters don't get benefits, should the grandchildren of the Rajakars get them? Now, I might butcher this. I'm going to try and say the slogan. But the students with that brilliant Bengali humor owned the insult. Their chant became, Amike tumike Rajakar Rajakar, ke boleche, shwoirachar. Or, who am I? Who are you? Traitor, traitor. Who says so? The dictator. The message was clear. You call us traitors, but you're the ones stealing our future. This is the legacy of British indirect rule. A small elite controlling everything. And now a year later, with the old regime's police on a bit of a silent strike, a security vacuum has opened up. While obviously this could open up space and opportunities for mutual aid, nefarious groups have come instead, especially those affiliated to the old regime who are trying to destabilize the country. And sorry to Sudan-splain again, but we've seen this happen too. When a revolution happens, a political void opens. And in addition to this, other political powers try to take hold. First, you've got the technocrats. This class kind of operates like a shadow cabinet of Western-educated elites from Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, who spent decades at the World Bank and IMF and NGOs. These institutions taught them to see poverty as a management challenge, not a political problem requiring the redistribution of wealth and power. They speak democracy's language while preserving colonialism's economic relationships. They love their suits. And despite his fame, I believe the interim leader, Mohammed Yunus, falls into this category. And then second, you have the old political parties, groups like the BNP and Jamaat-e Islami. They aren't angry that Hasina was a dictator. They're angry they weren't the ones in charge of the dictatorship. And so to distract from real issues, they also use culture wars, sometimes of an Islamist flavor, an equivalent of a Bangladeshi war on woke. The Jamaati's genius is transforming revolutionary energy into reactionary politics. Students who risk their lives for economic justice now find themselves debating hijab policies instead of land redistribution. The BNP and Jamaati leaders participate in committees while working to ensure no fundamental changes threaten their future prospects. They don't want the system to change. They just want power. Now, unfortunately, technocratic elites like Yunus often see these groups as easier partners to work with than the popular classes, even though they are the most likely to stab him in the back. And finally, you have the remnants of the old regime, loyalists to the Awami League, operating a deep state with security forces on their side, working to create chaos. I wish I could promise that they won't win. So, obviously, things are a bit complicated. The parties least representative of the revolution have the most to gain. Women and minorities are being sidelined, and students are heartbroken, especially while India also works overtime to ensure the revolution doesn't succeed. But while international media obsesses over parliamentary negotiations, the real organizing happens in rice paddies, textile factories, and urban slums. And by decolonization, we're not speaking in a metaphor. It means power for the popular classes. So if you're a young person in Bangladesh, tired of the main parties and the endless splits of the left, well, where do you look? You look at the popular movements. So in England, people get excited about a new party with, for example, 600,000 members. That's awesome. It's also cute because in Bangladesh, the Krishak Federation, a farmers' union, has 1.6 million members fighting for land reform. That's a revolutionary force. There are also robust trade unions, cultural organizations, and a vibrant underground left that the revolution has given new life to. Groups like the Purbo Bangla Communist Party and the Sarbohara Party. A new Democratic Left Alliance is holding mass protests, demanding a proper revolution, democratic control over land and factories, and an end to IMF control. But I'm Sudanese, so the thing that excites me most is this news of new people's committees that have spontaneously formed in villages and neighborhoods, just like the committees that became the backbone of our revolution. They're resolving land disputes, organizing community self-defense patrols, and providing basic services to their neighbors and the ones that they love. These grassroots groups are building alternative power structures that operate independently of who controls government buildings. And as a theorist Gramsci taught us, lasting power isn't just in state institutions. You have to win hearts and minds and organize the popular classes. These movements provide legal aid when courts fail. They organize protests when electoral politics fails and build mutual aid that reduces dependency on the state. They're creating parallel institutions capable of functioning during a crisis and maybe one day taking power. The question is, will a global anti-colonial movement have their back? I'm ready to have their back. Are you? Because things are far from perfect, but this shows that real space for change and for maneuver still exists. To understand this and more, we're joined by Seema Syeda, an anti-Islamophobic researcher who'll help us understand the context of the Monsoon Revolution. Thanks for joining. So we've gone into it. We've described what the Monsoon Revolution is. Do you think you can give us a little bit of context, more broadly, broader history on how this relates to colonialism?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me on this podcast. So I'm here in the UK as part of the Bangladeshi diaspora. I was born here, but I definitely have links to the wider history of Bangladesh. And part of the reason that I'm here is because of colonialism. So I do speak about this from that perspective. And for me, visiting Bangladesh when I was a child, there's this huge and clear disparity between the economic conditions of people living in Bangladesh and people in Britain. And for me, as a young Bangladeshi, I was really curious as to understand why that existed in the way it did. And the neoliberal world tells us that the problem is just the lack of free markets and the need for the growth of the bourgeois class and the middle class, and that's how Bangladesh would lift itself out of poverty. And this is the ideological viewpoint of those supporters of Yunus, for example. And when the revolution happened, we saw, for instance, the neoliberal Economist magazine having this big picture of those student revolutionaries, but erasing the Palestine flag from it. And this is a classic example of how that history of colonialism is obscured. So for me, I wanted to understand the actual history. And so I went and I studied history, and I focused on the history of the subcontinent and South Asia. And colonialism has this deep extractive relationship with Bangladesh, with what is now India, and with Pakistan, whereby Britain extracted trillions of pounds of wealth over a century and a half from the entire subcontinent. Now, the Bengal was one of the richest parts of the globe before the British went and invaded and colonized. A weaver in Bengal earned more than a weaver in Britain. And that textile wealth was something that Britain wanted. And so we can't ignore that century and a half of extraction and that century and a half of constant famine when we look at the structures in Bangladeshi society today. And today, that extraction is still happening. So, for instance, the garment industry produces something like 85% of Bangladesh's GDP, which is then exported out. Right, all of those goods are exported out from Bangladesh. So that wealth is being extracted from the country, and it's not being redistributed to the garment workers, most of whom don't even earn a living wage. And so in the Monsoon Revolution, what I'm curious to understand is how much of it did actually represent the voices of the vast majority of the poorest in Bangladesh, including women. About 80% of garment workers are women as well. And from the comms that I'm seeing from the student movement, there have been attempts to include that in the revolutionary discourse. But at the same time, I do think that students do also represent the urban middle class in some way. And I think colonialism there is one of the unwritten ideological basis of that structural inequality. So has this revolution really challenged that? I'm not sure it has yet. Can it challenge that? I hope it will. But I think what it needs is the support from the diaspora as well, Bangladeshi diaspora, to realise that systemic change is needed and to start funding and sending aid and mutual aid to those grassroots groups on the ground so that they can build their political organising and institutional mobilising forces, and to push further than the liberal limits that have been placed on the country by the technocrats and the liberals.
Absolutely. I mean, I wanted to take the opportunity maybe just to talk about what happened in Sudan, because there was, it also happened actually on July, but it happened on July 2019, a month after the Rapid Support Forces. And you, in Bangladesh, you also have a battalion called something similar to the Rapid Support Forces, called the Rapid Battalion Force or something like that, which is like, you know, this paramilitary force by the government and engaged in this horrific massacre in Sudan on June 3rd. But what matters is that a month later, because of international condemnation, but also a general strike, huge amounts of rallies and protests organized by this stratum, this urban stratum, who would have been, had given themselves a cushy management jobs if those jobs had existed, but then became kind of revolutionary, right? They were called the Sudanese Professionals Association. That gives you an indicator of the name. But what happened afterwards was there was, again, just like yesterday with the July declaration, lots of processions, people were really happy, the people making an announcement. There was the same thing. We had the civilian government which said, you know, we're going to pass these reforms, and people were celebrating in the streets. They wanted to celebrate for something because they needed to believe that this was going in the right direction. But some of us also were really critical, and not critical because we're trying to ruin people's mood, but critical because we knew that this wasn't going to lead to anywhere if there isn't radical reforms, and that ultimately, like, you just kind of tinker with the institutions a little bit and maybe do general elections and change the system, etc. At some point, that if you don't solve those structural issues, the military will be waiting and just be thinking, I want to take over that situation. And eventually a coup could happen. And I know that Bangladesh, just like Sudan, has had a history of coups. I guess I was wondering what you think, you know, is that a risk? And how do we prevent that?
I think we can't be naive about the reality of the risk that comes with true radical transformation of any society. And I think, as you say, the Sudanese can see that very clearly. And I would say that it's very easy for me sitting in an armchair in London to say, the Bangladeshi student movement and the revolutionaries need to, push forward and not accept the constitutional liberal status quo that Yunus is proposing. And by the way, let's be clear, that's way better than what came before. Sheikh Hasina was a brutal authoritarian tyrant, and we're very clear on that. One thing that we can hope is that the new constitution that the students are demanding can at least provide a space for freedom of association, for trade union organising, which has been heavily, heavily repressed. So that's something we can hope. But to be honest with you, if we look at the global trend, we have got a global capitalist, connected internationalist, organised movement or network that is pushing fascism everywhere. So, if you even look at the Indian context, Modi and the rise of populist fascism there, which is very anti-Bangladesh and anti-Bangladeshi identity, despite Modi kind of harbouring Hasina, these dangers are also there in the vacuum that's going to open up now. And I think that's even more points to why we should see ourselves, especially the Bangladeshi community in the UK and in America and in Europe, because there are many of us, right? We've been pushed out by colonial dynamics from our country, but we still have a deep link and care. We should use some of the privileges and the wealth that we can amass here to support a very, very strong revolutionary movement in Bangladesh that can beat back the military, that can beat back the neoliberals, and that also can stand up for minority rights and women's rights as well. Because unfortunately, and it is, even though this is, an Indian talking point or the old regime's talking point, it is true that we are seeing the marginalization of women leaders in the student movement as well. I've been looking back through some of the news reporting of it, and some of the women leaders who are really poignant and key voices during the revolution, I don't see them. Their voices are being erased, as well as I said earlier, the mass workers. Where are their voices too? So I think tactically and strategically, Bangladeshis do need to learn from what happened in Sudan, what's happening in Syria, and we do need to be aware of the very, very real risk of a military coup. And this also points to a need to connect internationally, and also to have a new vision and imagination of what our political institutions and what our political governance looks like. Are we just defined by the borders that the British Empire left for us? Or are we going to define ourselves as part of a global working class? And I know this can sound a bit trite, to talk about the global working class or sound too Marxist, but the fact is that unless we join up our struggles, we are going to be isolated against the forces of international capital. And so I think there's a lot of work that can be done here as well, in the belly of the beast, in the heart of empire, where a lot of that money is being extracted to fight for real economic and social justice. And I think we also need to be ready to make the kind of sacrifices that people on the ground in Bangladesh have been making for decades. I think here we are very scared of peaking the state. Our tactics here, we romanticize what people are doing around the world, what's happening in Sudan and Syria. How much are we willing to sacrifice here as well in order to reclaim and reappropriate the wealth that's been stolen?
Absolutely. So usually in these kinds of revolutionary situations, because we're struggling, let's be also honest about the fact that this era has not necessarily been the era of progressive forces. There have been many other different forces who've tried to contest and win the hearts and minds of the masses. And in that vacuum, I mentioned it a little bit in the script earlier, but you get the technocrats we've talked about, and we know that we need to push them back. What about the traditional parties who kind of almost want to ride on the coattails of this revolution to get into power and redo that cycle? How can people here in the diaspora, but even people in Bangladesh, prevent that from happening? Do you have any ideas on that?
I think from our position, we do also have the privilege of doing a bit more what I would call intellectual work or imaginary and visionary work, right? So I'm always inspired by what Frantz Fanon said around the Algerian Revolution. He said, if we fight off the colonizers and then we just copy the European institutions, we copy their ways, we copy their society, we copy their culture and we paste it, we're never going to have real liberation, right? And I think we have that liberty here of saying, actually, we don't need to rebuild Bangladesh on the failed model of British liberal bourgeois democracy, right? Britain, the so-called mother of parliaments, is what left Bangladesh with this kind of two-party state that then became authoritarian and turned into a one-party state. And that I don't see any kind of constitutional plan for something that can safeguard against that happening again. And let's look at what's happening here right now. We're seeing the rise of fascism here in Britain in the so-called mother of parliaments. And I think it's very, very likely that British democracy, liberal democracy itself will fail soon. Similarly, we've seen the same in the United States. So we need to be ready to say, actually, those people on the ground, in the grassroots who are organising these popular committees, the farmers' unions, the garments workers, those people who are trying to take power and redistribute at a hyper-local level, they're the ones that we need to learn from. We also need to build those connections and amplify those narratives and voices, but in a careful way, obviously, because we don't want to put them in a more unsafe position. And I think those connections are quite weak, to be honest with you, from my perspective in the diaspora. I don't hear a lot about what is happening in those spaces. I think I hear a lot about the political the high politics. I hear a lot about the party politics. I hear a lot about the authoritarianism. But what's actually going on in the villages and the grassroots organising, that's something that I think we can talk about a lot more and make much more a focus of our organising.
And I like hearing this from you, because one of the things, for example, in Sudan, we had 5,000 of these popular committees, or what we call resistance committees, all across the country. And during the whole transitional period, there was a sense for many of them, I'm not going to say all of them, that their role was mostly a secondary role. That yes, they do mutual aid. Yes, they do, they organize their community. They organize the peasants, they organize the community members, mutual aid, etc. But their role isn't necessarily to use that to create the institutions that could take power and reimagine power. And what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that we shouldn't accept the kinds of solutions that are put to us on the table, that we should try to reimagine power if this revolution can win. But if I wanted to shift this a little bit, at the same time as we talk about all of these amazing initiatives happening all across Bangladesh, which don't get enough attention, there is also a rise. This has been an opportunity for parties which were put down, and which is also, obviously wrong under a one-party dictatorship. I'm talking, for example, about the Jamaat-e-Islami, who actually are now finding that this is their moment, and they're organizing, unfortunately, pogroms. They're organizing protests even against the interim government for very modest women's rights reforms like equal inheritance, saying these are Western laws, these are anti-Islamic laws. How do we safeguard against the risk, both of ensuring that the martyrs of the revolution, who didn't die for these kinds of ideas, but who died for a Bangladesh where everybody is equal and everybody has opportunity, etc. How do we stop these other parties, or even the BNP, which when it was in rule, it was deeply implicated in the military apparatus. It also engaged in enforced disappearances and targeted assassinations. Yeah, how do we make sure that we don't let them kind of steal the revolution?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And just to say, obviously, as you've pointed out, the secular parties as well as Jamaat Islam have partaken in different violent and abusive tactics. And I think this is something that's been part of Bangladesh's political, I don't want to say culture, because it's not like it's something that's endemic to Bangladesh, but it's been there for decades. And so how do we actually push back against this? I think specifically for Jamaat Islam, it's also important to understand where the ideological roots of that party came from. And then again, I'm always about this. We go back to the British colonial period. So under British governance, India didn't exist, Bangladesh didn't exist, Pakistan didn't exist. The concept of the nation state was barely something that existed in people's consciousness, right? Before the British Empire, there was the Mughal Empire, which was much more syncretic in the way that it governed. So, you would have Hindu princes marrying Muslims, you would have Sufi dervishes coming to the palace, you would have a much, I would say, obviously, I'm not trying to be nostalgic for the past, but a much more syncretic and open culture. When the British came, they brought their Enlightenment theories of racialization and of anthropology and categorization and looked at India and said, you have these people with these languages, you have the Hindus, you have the Muslims, you have the Sikhs, and we're going to divide and rule these communities. And MI6 and Winston Churchill had quite a huge interest in amplifying different ethno-nationalist and separatist ideologies. And all of the rulers that then took over and controlled the nationalist states, India and Pakistan, like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Nehru, they were all Oxford and Cambridge educated intermediaries of empire who came and brought that colonial mindset back to the subcontinent and copied those institutions and ruled in that way. There was a campaign of flyering and leafleting for the Muslim League and Muslim separatism funded by the British state around the time of the partition of India. So that ideological element of the Muslim League actually does have strong links to British colonialism, and that's the roots of the Jamaat Islam movement as well. And this is something that we don't talk about a lot in the diaspora as well, that link between colonialism and some political Islamic groups in the area, in the country. And so, again, what can we do to actually confront this? Well, firstly, there are things that we can learn from how these groups are organizing. So for Islamic groups, there is local community organizing happening. And actually, sometimes the physical space of the mosque is a space where you can bring people together and where you can form local organizing units. There's also a lot of faith-based practices like feeding the poor, feeding the hungry, providing legal services, all of these kind of things that you're saying some of the other popular committees have been doing. I think Jamaat Islam has been doing that as well. And in the end, when we're in this neoliberal order where people are struggling to organize and struggling to find community and find group identity, that's where those who can provide that in whatever flawed way do become a pole of attraction. And it's the same thing in India under Modi, for instance, this ethno-nationalism, Hindutva. This is bringing together the lost souls of the neoliberal agenda who've been cut loose to fend for themselves in this cutthroat economic world, and for them to realize, oh, we're part of a group that will protect us against this kind of enemy. And so the left and social movements, we do have to learn from that, and we do have to put more energy into that, building meaningful organizing and connection on the ground and building dual power where we can take the role of the state in some ways. And again, what can we do if we're not in Bangladesh or if we're in the diaspora? It's build those links with the people who are doing that on the basis of real equality, women's rights, and share our wealth with those groups, essentially.
I agree. I think the role of the diaspora is really, really important. Just the wage differentials. It goes a long way, giving someone a wage to be a paid organizer, just to work on these kinds of projects, goes a long way. I guess on the last question, we've talked about Bangladesh, and obviously, despite the fact that it's complicated, we were also mentioning is that it's inspiring, right? Regardless of the fact that 1,400 people were killed, all of this organizing that's taken place, and they overthrew a dictatorship, right? That is amazing. What can we learn about here? We're seeing the rise of the far right here. Some of the same stuff you were just talking about. How can we bring that to Britain?
I think here as well, there's so much poverty and neglect in so many parts of this country. And people here are also suffering deeply under the neoliberal economy, right? And it's really tough, I think, to move away from what a lot of our movement here focuses on, which is like high-level party politics, a lot of online activism, which I think is really important. But then if we're not also going out into our communities and building real links on the ground and also trying to build dual power in our communities, we open up that space for the far right to do it, because the far right is doing that. And they obviously get a lot of funding to do that. And I think it's really about pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone and going out and, you know, instead of spending 2 hours scrolling on Instagram, how
Guilty.
about me too? Like, I'm totally guilty of all of these things as well. And it's something that I'm always thinking about. How about we go and organize something on our street? Like, even if it's something as simple as a street party where, you know, everyone brings a dish, you get to know your neighbors. And then you can build on that into something like, how do we have a mutual aid thing happening on our street if there's somebody who's going hungry or can't, you know, afford to eat? How can we support that person? If there's somebody who has a disability who can't access benefits, how do we support that person to access what they need? How do we start giving that material support in our community so that we can show that actually there is a bond here, that where you can trust each other and where you can see that agency is with people to actually change our material conditions. And I think that that's also the way that we undercut the power of the mainstream media, which is never going to be on our side. Social media now is, the algorithms are being really, really controlled. I personally am quite pessimistic. I think that using the internet as an organizing model, it's been great and has catalyzed many revolutions, but exactly because it has that power, it's also something that we can very quickly lose and will be cut off. So we need to build those on-the-ground networks. And I think there's also a way in which no one can say exactly what the future is going to look like and what our ideal society will look like. It's in the practice and in the building that we then develop that. So perhaps let's just take that first step and go out into the community and start building community organizing. And the other thing I think that we really need to do is also think about community defense and self-defense, because as we've seen, repression and violence is the main organizing tactic of the state against any revolutionary or radical force. You know, we've seen the Metropolitan Police purchase something like 12 Sandcat tanks from the Israeli army, and they've been patrolling London. You know, this is completely inappropriate if you think about it from what our society looks like now, but it gives us a hint as to what the state is preparing for, right? And so I don't think it's paranoid to say we also need to prepare to be able to defend ourselves from this kind of state repression. And in the Bangladeshi case, the fact is that the army eventually refused to follow those orders, right? It eventually refused to keep shooting on the Bangladeshi population. And so how do we build that kind of popular legitimacy and popular power in the community such that actually
Thank you so much for that. And I think the big lesson here, and I take this from actually a theorist who I look up to quite a lot, his name is Antonio Gramsci, who's taught us that power isn't just in institutions like the state, that you also really have to also win hearts and minds and cultural power if you want to be able to have the popular classes not only take power for a little bit of time, but to hold on to it. And on that note, I would like to thank you all for joining us on this episode of Decolonial Dispatch. Remember, decolonization is not a metaphor. If this report was valuable to you, share it with your networks and become a supporter of our work at decolonialcenter.org. Join our newsletter. I'm Mohammed, and I'll see you in a fortnight. Please like and subscribe. It would go a long, long way. And if you write a comment, we really appreciate it, because we're trying to grow. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Decolonial Dispatch.